different things that schools have put in place during the pandemic has made an impact to where we are now. So in other words, we have a lot of things to do. We are going to have discussions based on context because every person's context is different. But more importantly, let's explore what we can with each other. And together with that, I will invite everyone to dialogue, to engage, and to exchange best practice. And moreover, since all of our contexts are different, what could be proven true for me might not be true for another person. And it's important that we give leeway for these different perspectives that come in from different individuals within the group of our discussion. So I might have experienced something in my school context that could not be relevant or would not be relevant to another person. So that's okay. And I think the big thing that we intend to take away from this session is for us to be able to engage and to exchange best practices throughout these dialogues and discussions. Okay, so as always, I would love to know what role you are playing in your respective school context. If you're a school leader, what school leader are you? If you are a leader who's aspiring to be a principal, or if you're a teacher aspiring to be a leader, let's see. And this will help me contextualize things a bit when we get deeper into the discussion. Okay. So we have a majority of the people in here are teacher leaders. Let's check our chat. Yes, so in our chat, we also have several teachers. Right, this is very good. So it will allow us to give perspective in terms of our discussion. All right. Thank you. And if you could share, and I'll give you 1 minute to 2 minutes for this, what is your expectation from this session? And it would help if you can be specific when you share this expectation. So I'll put my timer on and I'll give you 1 to 2 minutes to share what your expectation is. Okay. In other words, what might be your expected takeaway after our 1.5 hours to 2 hours of discussion? One more minute. Looking into leadership, looking at teaching, looking at readiness, innovation. Hopefully, we'll get to touch several of these aspects that you are mentioning in your responses. So thank you. So just to put things in perspective, our discussion today will focus more on teachers, right? We will be able to touch base a little bit on pedagogy and learning. Okay, time's up. So thank you for your responses. And I could see that several people are putting things like assessment types and pedagogy. While yes, we will be looking at, we'll be touching a little bit of these things, but the depth of our discussion today will be focusing more on the teacher's readiness within the framework by which they operate, and potentially, provide the participants with structures that will help them successfully carry out the expectations of the year. All right. So the school year is about to end. And what did you learn from the closing of the academic year, and what new initiative will you introduce in the coming year? So, if looking at what has transpired over the last 10 months since you started classes with your respective teachers, your respective colleagues, with your students, what did you learn towards the closing of the academic year? And what new initiative based on these learnings will you introduce in the coming year? So I'll give you 2 minutes to think about this and to respond to the prompt. Okay, so thank you for your responses. A lot of adjustments this school year. Learners and teachers have a lot to catch up on. In in terms of what I want to introduce, it would be nice to strengthen parents' role in the academic life. This is very important. Thank you for citing this. Whenever I meet with parents, I would always tell them it's a shared responsibility. It's a shared partnership. You don't expect to send kids to school and then suddenly just expect a miracle to happen at the end of the year. It's always a shared partnership if you want to achieve a lot of things with the students. So thank you for citing that. Activities that can be accomplished for 10 to 20 minutes, that wouldn't take much of time. Okay, and then setting up learning modalities in terms of blended learning. Okay, thank you. Innovative teaching practices. Right. Educational system facing learning loss. This is very common, especially I'm gonna talk more about this later. Mixed modality of learning, adapting hybrid mechanisms. All right. Difficult to connect with my students in in the physical classroom. Okay. That's not new. So they are expecting higher grades. I think this is very true regardless of which part of the world you're in. Even in the in the midst of the pandemic, when I was in Qatar, it was the same thing. You know, you had this sense of entitlement among learners and their parents, where they expect the highest grade and then suddenly blame the pandemic for not getting the grades that they need to see. All right. Initiating programs that could assess the reading readiness of students. Thank you. Academic gaps. Effective concrete plan to address learning gaps. Hopefully, we can look at tools later that can address those. Educational system approach is changing suddenly. Assess the students' needs. All right. Thank you for being very student-centric in your responses. I think this is what's amazing when you're talking to teachers. They're more connected to the ground, and they have more specific examples in terms of the learning gap and understanding the needs of students. So thank you. All right. Okay, same thing in the chat. All right, moving on. As mentioned earlier, so I've been in education. Just to introduce myself a little bit more, I've been in international teaching since 2011. So I started off in the United Arab Emirates, and then I went off to Qatar, and I was in Qatar for 9 years. And then I am now completing my first year as secondary principal in India, in one of the leading international schools in the country. So most of my leadership experience has been on international education. I did start off, as mentioned earlier, as a teacher in the Philippines setting. So just to put things into perspective, yes, I do know what Filipino teachers go through, because I've been there myself in my first, especially in my first 5 years of this teaching, in terms of my teaching profession. And I am still in touch with several peers who are engaged in the public school sector. So it is I am very aware of what our teachers are going through in terms of challenges and obstacles along the way. All right. So in terms of wrapping up what you've mentioned earlier, as I've mentioned in the start when we were looking at your responses, our topic today will focus more on teachers' readiness. So whether you're the subject teacher or you're the teacher leader within your school context, this will put this into perspective within your framework, right? So what I've put down here is a list of things that we could potentially anticipate as the school year progresses. So you started blended learning back in August, November. Some of your schools might already be in fully in full face-to-face mode now, you know. So as you get along with your students, as you get reintegrated into the system, you will look at different things and see different things and discover different things, right? One of the things there is, you will note that there is a need for continuous development because the pandemic has changed so many things. It will be a game of trial and error. Some of the things that worked well before the pandemic might not work at this time anymore. And while in the Philippine setting, there are a lot of systems in place, particularly in the public school setting, right? The next step there is, how do we use these different scaffolds to lead with wisdom? Because at the end of the day, while we have so many structures, how are we leading with compassion? How are we leading with empathy? How are we leading knowing and keeping in mind that the parties we are dealing with are human beings as well? No, so you're dealing with students, you are dealing with parents, you are dealing with teachers and colleagues who might still be in the verge of getting through whatever they encountered during the pandemic. So all of us had different episodes of challenges during the pandemic, and at times we need to lead with empathy and with wisdom in that process. And of course, as you've mentioned earlier, what about the gaps in learning? right? There's so many gaps. There are so many things that we need to address in their literacy, because 2 years ago, when the learning modules went home, sinong gumagawa ng assignment? Si mom, si dad, si tita, si tito. Sila yung sumasagot ng mga learning modules. Diba? So it's very tricky, but at the same time, it's already there. So now, how do we address these gaps? And of course, the other thing that's been in the radar, I've been dealing with this a lot this year, the gaps in students' social-emotional development. Because we have to realize that when schools shut down in March of 2020 globally, they were then put into these containers, the students were put into these containers where they had to deal with their own thing on their own. They had very little chance of socializing with other learners from the same age group. So there are different and the varying levels of social emotional challenges within your classrooms. I'm dealing with a fourth year ninth grade student this year, but whenever I talk to him, he behaves like he's in grade 7 or grade 6. So it's very interesting that that these things should not fall in the cracks, because we also need to deal with this as leaders. We owe this to our students. And of course, as we've said, it's changed many things. It's changing education, it's changing pedagogy, it's changing teachers. So this year, as we concluded this year, we hired teachers locally and globally. It's very difficult to find the right teachers to put in front of students, because a lot of the really good teachers have started giving up. I have a physics teacher who wanted to go into the corporate world, leave education and see what she can do to contribute in a more corporate setting. So there's been a brain drain or a burnout in the education sector when it comes to teachers. So that's another thing we need to look at. Of course, the pandemic has also looked at teaching and learning, has looked at the way processes and operations go about within the school setting. So in other words, there are a lot of moving pieces within the school setting, right? So we're not just dealing with teachers, but also the working parameters and the working environment where the teachers and the students are operating. So we need to keep that in mind. So in terms of the topic, we are looking at readiness, right? And let's just keep this definition into mind, the state of being fully prepared for something or willingness to do something. And when we talk about our teachers, yes, they have been in this situation for a year where there were so many constant variables. So the next step now is, how ready are they for the next step of the journey or the next chapter of that journey? Let's unpack that. All right. If you are not a school leader, why are you aspiring to be a school leader? If you are a school leader, why? So there are different answers. There are choices we've put in. There we go. So why are we leaders? Or if you are an aspiring leader, why are you aspiring to be a leader? So are you, is it because you want to help in coordinating? You want to look at efficiency, you want to look at function, you want to look at learning, you want to manage. Okay, so I'll give you 30 seconds for this. And if you are in the chat, please feel free to respond A, B, C, D, or E in the Zoom chat. Thank you. So I'll give you 30 seconds for this. Okay, managing learning. All right. Parang election returns lang ah. So learning and managing naglalaban. All right. So all of these are relevant answers, right? But at the end of the day, there's only one answer. And for those who responded learning, right? For those who responded learning, that is the answer we are looking for. So we are school leaders because we are there to make sure that there is an impact on student learning and achievement, right? We are there to help students learn. This is something that I usually show in terms of different examples of what it means to be high functioning and high impact. So if you look at this for the first 30 seconds to 1 minute, there are different examples of high functioning and high impact on student learning. And I'll give you 30 seconds to read through it, and then I'll discuss. So for those of you who responded managing, coordinating, function, all of these are still correct answers, right? But at the end of the day, we do these things because of one thing, and that is impact on student learning. So everything that you do. So in my case, I have annual goal setting with my teachers. So we set goals at the start of the year. And one of the question there is, if you're planning to do X, Y, and Z, why are you doing it? And how does it impact student learning? So kung ang goal ng teacher from the start of the year is to look at other relevant types of assessments. Okay, if you are looking at different types of assessments, why are you doing it? And how is that going to impact student learning? And why would you like to do that to support that impact on student learning? At the end of the day, it's all about the students. We want things to be in order because we want our students to experience a well thought of plan on how they're being supported in terms of the concurrency of the curriculum, in terms of how they're being assessed, in terms of how they're being assisted within their respective school setting, right? So yung organization, yung management, all of these should align with student learning, right? If you're doing something because it's for the sake of pampalapad ng papel or nagpapahaba ng papel yung division, that's a different story. At the end of the day, the question there is, yes, let's do this, but if we're going to do this, how is it going to impact our students? How is it going to impact their achievement? How are they learning? Is it addressing the learning gaps? You know, so those are the different things that we need to ask. All right, moving on. At the end of the day, the reason why I showed you that grid, why I showed you the difference between function and impact, right, you might want to reflect which of these quadrants your school belongs to, right? Are you in quadrant 1, where you are a high functioning, high impact school? Or are you in quadrant 2? You are high functioning. That means you're doing really well on the organization. You're doing really well on the coordination and putting things in order, but you still need to do a lot in terms of addressing learning gaps, right? Quadrant 3 is you're low functioning and low impact, right? So that means you don't have things in place, and at the same time, your students are suffering academically. And of course, quadrant 4 is by some force of impossible miracle, but it does happen. It's because you have the right people in your team and also the right students in your team, right? So it could be a low functioning school, but still getting the best results out of it, right? So for 1 minute, I want you to use the chat box again. Which of these quadrants does your school fall under, right? Which of these quadrants does your school fall under? Does it fall under high functioning, high impact, or quadrant 2, quadrant 3, or quadrant 4? So I'll give you 1 minute to respond. So you can just state whether you're in 1, 2, 3, or 4. So you are invited to reflect on your school setting. So in my school setting, nasa quadrant 1 ba kami? Are we in quadrant 2, 3, or 4? Okay, it's good to see a lot of people in quadrant 1. And again, it's important that you are aware of where you are. If you are in quadrant 1, the question you will need to ask yourself and your team members is, how do we stay there? Right? How do we stay there? What are our metrics for saying we are in quadrant 1? Diba? Are you looking at grades? Are you looking at external assessments? How are you identifying, or how are you determining that your school is high impact? Right? Those are key questions that you need to ask within your teams when you go back to your school setting. If you are in quadrant 2, 3, or 4, the question that you would ask your team is, how do we get to the next quadrant that we are aspiring for? So for example, if you are in quadrant 4, you might want to ask your team, how do we get to quadrant 1? Or if we are in quadrant 2, how do we get to quadrant 1? And in many cases, if we are in quadrant 3, how do we get to quadrant 2 and then 1? So we need to ask these questions and reflect on the process that you have within your team members or within your respective teams at school. All right. So I've put this in the link at the back of the presentation, which you will have. And there are so many things that this particular document has put together. So Microsoft and the Education World Forum put together this white paper in June 2021. So a year after the breakout of the pandemic. And it identified different things that schools will be facing after the pandemic, right? So this summarizes so many different areas, from what students will encounter to what teachers will encounter. Where do we get help from? And how do we support teachers? How do we leverage community help? And so for those individuals na nagsabi kanina, get the parents involved. That is one way. In many cases, how do we get the local government involved? How do we get the barangays involved in our school setting if we are in the public school? So different ways, because as they say, it takes a village to raise a child. It's something that that we need to do in partnership with the various agencies around us. Okay, so this is worth a read. And again, factors that have been stated, which are still relevant up to this point and will be relevant for the next couple of years, because this is what we are gearing towards to. How do we address these gaps? How do we address the equity issue? Diba? So we can conclude at this time that not all students have equity, because one student might have access to learning resources, one student might have access to the internet while the others don't. So there are so many different things that has transpired in the last 2 years. And then the next question now is, how do we bring students back to speed or up to date, or how do we bring them to where they should be? So it's the how questions that are coming up now. And it's all about rewiring. And I want to talk about a little bit about rewiring, because at times we have 2019, before the pandemic, ito yung mga practices na meron tayo. These were the practices that we had put in place before the pandemic. And then boom, March 2019, the pandemic happens, shuts down all the schools. And then there's this 2-year void. And then come August, November 2022, DepEd says, all right, let's start. We can start with hybrid. We can start with trial face-to-face, whatever the decision is in your respective divisions, right? You had your own challenges. But at the same time, there's been this constant practice that's been going on globally na pinipilit ibalik yung mga practices na sinimulan or I would say the practices that have been put in place in 2019, pilit binabalikan. And hindi natin nakikita na, all right, there has been that 2-year gap, right? And that 2-year gap simply says that not everything that applied in 2019 could still apply in 2023, because the situations have changed drastically. So we need to rewire our minds. We need to adapt to certain things. I have teachers coming to me saying, Oliver, we should put this back. I would always tell them, pause, let's pause for a while. Let's park that idea. Let's see how the other things are panning out at this point. Because there are certain practices that might not be relevant anymore. So let's look at this. And with these different changes that are taking place, we need to ask the question now, right? Because things have changed, things have been affected. Before we do something, we need to ask ourselves. We need to ask our teams. When we come back to school, or when we come back to school in the coming academic year, how do we want communication to look like? How will collaboration look like? How will learning environments look like? And day-to-day operations, and potentially health protocols. In our school next year, COVID will be regarded as another cold or another fever or another flu. So you get COVID, come to school, wear a mask, and that's it. So we're getting into that in our school setting. But again, when depending on where you are, and depending on which part of the world you are, it could be different as well, right? So these are things that would impact students, and these are things that would also impact learning. And more importantly, because it involves students and learning, it will also impact your teachers. Right? They will have an impact on your teachers. So for example, health protocols. Sasabihin ng teacher, all right, if that student is excused for 7 days for getting COVID, what will happen to their assessments? What will happen to the lessons that they missed? What will happen to the learning gaps that will incur during the 5 to 7 days that that particular student is out? And also there are follow-up questions that will impact your teachers. All right. So before we look at structures, I would like you to think about one example that you have observed which has impacted your colleagues and teachers and if you're a leader, look at what has impacted your teachers. If you are a teacher, what is impacting your colleagues or have impacted your colleagues after the pandemic? So let's talk teachers, right? And sometimes because it's been so busy, we tend to forget that there's a human being behind that table or in front of that projector or in front of that chalkboard. So I'll invite you for 2 minutes to identify things that you have observed in terms of your colleagues after the pandemic. So I'll give you 2 minutes for that. And you can use the Zoom chat if you're not on Peer Deck. Okay, thank you for your responses. Right, let's look at. I really appreciate what was put in there about adaptability and resiliency. The 2 years has been very difficult, but at the same time, it gave us a chance to try different things. How to be adaptable, how to be resilient, and how to be flexible in different times, in different occasions. ICT technology, it's fast tracked that need for people to learn. So in a way, it's good, and in another way, it's also it came as a double-edged sword. So it got teachers into that high-speed mode to get adapted to the technology, but at the same time now, there's this expectation that you should be innovating in class, which would mean it's additional workload on teachers. So let's talk about that later. Let's discuss that later. Right? Reports, yes. Students' behavior and attitude, that is so true. This is impacting teachers because in the last 2 years, students were just in front of their computers, and you did not need to worry about student discipline because they were in the confines of their home. And now they're coming back to school with a 2 to 2.5 year social gap, and they don't know how to conduct themselves. And for us, teachers, what pains me is to see teachers who think that there's a golden or a magical wand that would change students dramatically. So, iniisip ng mga teachers, pag report sa akin yung isang problema about students' behavior, overnight magbabago yung behavior ng bata. We need to give students a little bit of credit that it has been a difficult year for them. And it is our responsibility as leaders to look at different ways and different approaches on how to get students to adapt. The caseload of our guidance counselor has increased dramatically before the pandemic and now. There's this huge gap. Yung caseload ng guidance counselor namin has gone up to 300 to 400% in terms of caseload. So it's important for us to see how these things happen. All right. Resourcefulness, adaptability. All right. Thank you for your answers. Let's look at one example. And since technology was one of the things that were cited, you apparently might have already heard about ChatGPT, right? You might already come across this, especially if you are working with grade 5 and up, grade 5 to high school and even university level. ChatGPT has been an example of free generative AI or artificial intelligence. There are different ways by which it could be used. So, for example, in this particular case, I tried to do something to ask it a question. I asked it a question and stated, who is Ferdinand Magellan? And it gave me this wonderful 5-paragraph work, right, on Ferdinand Magellan. I even asked it to explain a concept in biology for me in terms of mitosis. And I even asked different questions. Now, I'm not going to post this question. I asked this question to other groups that I had this conversation with. But if you were making the decision about ChatGPT, will you allow it or ban it, right? Because the reason why I asked that, back in February, when ChatGPT was on its way up to fame, right? When it was on its way up to fame, nagiging sikat na siya at that time. Two different groups, two educational groups have opposing views on ChatGPT. The New York City school said it should be banned, while the International Baccalaureate, which offers an international qualification to high school students, says that no, it should be used. It should be allowed for students to quote content and to create things. It could aid them in creating things, right? So there are different ways by which ChatGPT is perceived. Some think it's useful, some think it's a way back in the wrong direction. Now, even in my own school, there are teachers who say, oh, we need to go back to pen and paper testing. No, this doesn't. ChatGPT should not be an invitation for people to go back to old ways. ChatGPT is in fact one thing that we could do and use in order for us to upgrade and upskill the way we teach students in the classroom, right? So probably 30 years ago or 40 years ago, calculators were not allowed in the classroom, right? In the high school classroom. But now, schools provide calculators in the classroom to aid with complex equations. So why is this being treated differently? Anyway, that's just a thought, right? Now, I've asked ChatGPT to explain to me the concept of mitosis if I was explaining it to a fourth grade student, right? And so it gave me this one paragraph output on how it could be explained to someone in fourth grade. But what are we trying to say here? ChatGPT could be a tool that we could use in addressing certain gaps within the classroom setting. My biology teacher counterpart, my biology teacher colleague, not counterpart, but my colleague in my school now, she uses ChatGPT for students to fact check. So what she would do is, all right, here's a concept that we're studying in biology. Ask ChatGPT what it says. And after you have extracted what ChatGPT said, how are you going to use the sources that we have within the classroom, within the digital libraries, to check if what ChatGPT is saying is true and acceptable? So what this particular colleague of mine did is it allowed inquiry to happen within the classroom. It allowed students to utilize research skills within the classroom setting, so that way they could make learning happen more organically and more engaging for the students. That's just one example. So what am I saying here? We shouldn't box things because they are threatening us or they appear to be threatening, but there are other ways by which we could use ChatGPT. You know, we could use it in different ways, in different forms, but at the end of the day, we need to look at how it could help our teachers. Right? I even asked ChatGPT, this was back in March, you know, what is the state of Philippine teachers after the COVID-19 pandemic? So it's given me examples of different challenges that teachers are encountering in the Philippines. Now, one thing about ChatGPT is not everything that ChatGPT says is true, right? This is a program. We don't know the paradigm by which this program was created. So may kanya-kanyang pananaw yung mga programmers nito eh. So it could be programmed in a different way. So that's why fact checking is still important. You know, so it's not one source of everything. My students use it to explain complex content to them. So let's say they are studying something in physics or in business management or in economics. It's proven to be very difficult. So ang ginawa ng mga bata, they go into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT to simplify that topic that they are reading or they are studying in class. So it's become their tutor in the home, right? So there are different ways by which you could make a positive spin out of this. Because I have a lot of old-fashioned colleagues that says, no, I'm going back to pen and paper. Okay, why are you going back to pen and paper? Why don't you do oral reflections? You know, you've got Flipgrid. Why don't you use Flipgrid to make kids record their reflection rather than writing it down, which could be prone to copying and pasting? You know, so there are different ways by which assessments can take place, and ChatGPT might be one way to help you. Again, just one example of technology, and you know, coincidentally, this has come up within the pandemic or right after the pandemic. And it should be seen as an opportunity. Together with that opportunity, there's a need, right? There's a need to upgrade. And I'm quoting this from Heidi Hayes Jacobs' work on Curriculum 21 under the topic of upgrading content. So at the end of the day, especially now, when you are citing in your own context that there are gaps in literacy, there are gaps in numeracy, there are learning gaps within your school context. Now is the time to start looking at the curriculum with your teams. You know, what should content look like? And as we look at the content, we should ask, what should we keep? What should we cut? And what should be created? Together with that, you need to make sure that teachers are up to date. We need to make sure that students have the opportunity to learn professionally with regards to their respective craft. So it's not just asking them to update a piece of document, but it's also providing teachers the support so that way they have the capacity to upgrade the curriculum. ChatGPT is just an example of a tool that could be used as a resource in the classroom, but it doesn't replace the teacher. It doesn't replace your assessments. It should, however, revolutionize the way you carry out assessments, the way you design learning engagements in the classroom. So how do we use a tool like ChatGPT to train our teachers, explore different things with our teachers, so that way they are not left behind, right? Okay, so Anami, you raised your hand.
Oh, sir, just approving it. Yeah, I confirm, no, what you're saying.
All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. Moving on. So what do we do next? I'm just using ChatGPT as an example, but there are other things that would spring out in your own school context. And the key thing there would be answering the how questions, because this will now involve operations. This will now involve things that you need to do. So how will this affect teachers? How will it affect students? How will it affect policy building? So for example, when ChatGPT came out, I had to meet with students. I had to meet with student council. I had to meet with students from different year groups. I had to meet with subject teachers and different school leaders, because we need to make sure that we have a system in place in case things go haywire. So there are different ways that we need to look at, or different things that we need to look at. So how will this affect our schools? How will it impact our school's philosophy and guiding statements and values? Right? How will it fit in with your idea of digital citizenship, or your school's idea of digital citizenship? All right. Let us, I'll give you 1 minute to respond to this. What are the challenges facing educators in your school context? Right? Challenge. And then after that, maybe we'll go on a 10-minute break. Right? So if you could please, I'll give you 2 minutes to respond to this. And then after that, we'll proceed to a 10-minute break if you need to go for coffee or stretch, right? So 2 minutes to respond to this, and then we'll go for our break. Okay, Sir Paolo, maybe we'll start the 10-minute clock for the break, and I'll stop sharing my screen for a while.
Sure, sir. So our dear school leaders, our dear educators, let's now take a 10-minute break. You can have your coffee break, water break, comfort room break. So we'll be back after 10. So just stay in on our Zoom call. Thank you so much, everyone.
Hey, welcome back. I hope everyone had a chance to get something to drink and stretch. All right, so I was looking at the responses provided by our teachers, and it's yeah, the challenges are of varying areas of focus. So some of this would be dependent on the student's behavior. Some of them would be based on academic gaps, right? Mathematics and science for some areas. For some areas, it's the 3 Rs. The attitude of learners. So there are different things that we could look at. And over the next few slides, we're going to look at different strategies that we could use in terms of teacher collaboration. In terms of, I'm looking at the meeting chat. So same thing, comprehension, numeracy, academic recovery, right? So and yes, in the Philippines, particularly in the public school sector, it's very much noted that certain things are being thrown on teachers' plates. For example, things that a registrar should be doing or a school nurse should be doing is even put on the responsibilities of teachers. So I totally get what Miss Marvelin is saying here in the chat. All right, so thank you for your responses. And again, as I've mentioned earlier, everything has a different, every place, every school leader, and every team would have its own challenges depending on their context, right? A school in India would have a different set of problems or concerns or challenges compared to a school in the Philippines. And more so, private and public schools in the Philippines would also have their own set of challenges. So we need to contextualize things. So we should have a more conceptual approach on how we work towards these challenges and how we come up with solutions towards these challenges. So the last thing I put here is let's go back to the basics. And what does that mean? That means we need to look at our context, right? That means we need to look at our landscape within our school. You know, when we have change and when there is a need for change to happen, we need to check the temperature. We need to look at different areas in which the productivity or the efficacy of what we intend to do could be affected. And this could be affected by different things. And according to the Harvard College, the president and fellows of Harvard College in 2020, they cited that in order to manage your context, you need to look at 4 things. You need to look at the political landscape by which you are operating. You need to look at the resistance and anticipate the resistance, expect the resistance that you will get from your team. You need to look at your own leadership team. Who are the key people involved in your team? And of course, that momentum for change. You identify that there's a need for change. You advocate for that change, and you make sure that you keep rallying towards that change if you really want it to happen. Because as leaders, the moment you make that move, that cause, that advocacy die down, that momentum will also die down. When we talk about going back to the basics, it looks at the main pillars of your existence as a school. If I go around the room and ask all the 60 plus members in this room to tell me what their vision, mission, and objectives are as a school, now, will you be able to summarize that for me? If you can, that's very well and good, right? The second thing there is, yes, I do know my vision, mission, and objectives. I know my school's vision, mission, and objectives. So now the next question is, if we're going to make change happen, how are these things aligned with our vision, mission, and objectives? Always go back to that. Because if you are looking for change, and that change is to support student learning and student achievement, and it aligns perfectly with your school's guiding statements, then you are in the right course of action. And you should be supported for that. Right? As school leaders, there are different roles that you can play. Are you the visionary? Are you the architect? Or are you the network builder? So when you're a visionary, you're the person who looks at and sees the end in mind. This is what we foresee. This is what we want to happen. This is what we want to do. Right? If you are the architect, you are the person who likes to build things within your own context. All right. If we are encountering problems with student behavior, what are the different things that we could build and put in place to support teachers who are observing this gap or who are experiencing this gap? You like to design things to support the change. Are you the network builder? Are you the person who depends on other individuals in order to become successful? You're the type of leader who taps the talent of your colleagues, who taps your resources in your local government, who taps the resources in your parent body, so that way you could build something for your learners. So you're creating networks around your school context. Now, you don't need to answer if you are a visionary architect or network builder, because that answer might vary from time to time. Maybe in this academic year, you are required to be more of an architect. In the next year, you might be required to be more of a network builder because you need to connect with other universities and colleges to make connections for your students and for your teachers. And in the following year, because you are going into strategic planning for your school, you might be required to be more of a visionary. So the role that you play will depend on the demand of the time. So you could be asked at this point to be a visionary, even though you really want to be an architect, but certain times you are called to be something else, right? And again, you need to know what role you're playing in the school in order to address those challenges, right? The reason why we're putting this out there is because you're dealing with human beings. You are dealing with a lot of human dynamics in the process. You are looking at things that require organizational renewal and self-renewal. But as it rightly states here, you need to change yourself first before you can go into organizational renewal. Right? So in order to make changes within your organization, the change needs to happen from within, whether it's personal or intra-organizational. The transformation needs to happen first in order for us to impact the bigger picture. As they say, you cannot give what you do not have. All right. Let's look at different structures. Right? You have identified different problems in your responses in the slide before we went for the break, right? So let's look at a more conceptual way of addressing these gaps. As we say, we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to solving problems because all our contexts are different. So the PDCA cycle allows us to look at things by planning, identifying your problems, looking at potential solutions, checking if these solutions would work, and then implement the solution if they do work. This particular cycle involves improvement within your structure, and it also involves you taking teachers on board so that way you could do something together. If I look at this, right, in your own context, let's say you're the school that identified that, all right, it's student behavior that you are looking at. So that's your problem, right? Now, once you've identified the problem, what are the different solutions that you could sit together with your team in order to address this, right? Maybe these students aren't coming to school because they don't have the financial resources to get to school. Number two, a reason could be the students aren't ready. They're not in that right state of mind to be coming back to school. Maybe some of these students are working. That's why they couldn't go to school. Different scenarios might call for different responses, right? So now that you've identified those problems, what are the potential solutions that you could introduce looking at your team? You know, do you put up Saturday support classes for the students who are working? Or do you do intervention and home visits to families? You know, do you call parents in? If the parents aren't responsive, do you do home visits? Right? There are different potential solutions to these problems in order to check in with the members of your community. So you check the results. If the solutions, the potential solutions that you've identified are yielding results, then maybe you could come up with a plan of action that would eventually help improve attendance and student morale within the school community. You know, so there are different reasons why students might not want to come to school. You know, it could even boil down to bullying, availability of resources, different things. It could be different reasons. We don't know, right? But it's important to wrap your head around it as a team and list these down. And this is one structure that you could use, you know? So the PDCA cycle. What the pandemic has put us in is an eggshell or an egg crate model for schools. So what happened was, all right, I'm the biology teacher. I'll work on my own. Here's my curriculum. I need to make sure that from point A to point B, I deliver these things. And then the math teacher says the same thing. And then the English teacher says the same thing. And then the moment you know it, there's no longer that room for collaboration and that room for horizontal integration of the curriculum, right? So what we are invited to do now is, how do we make collaboration happen within our staff members? How do we become an inclusive leader, right? So how do we bring people on board? How do we get people to rally with you as a result of that effective collaboration, right? So one of the challenges that we will need to do now is, how do we take out that egg crate model so that way there are no more divisions, but we are now fostering a system that could work where teachers are working together, right? So inclusive leadership. Now let's differentiate between the two. There is what we call an instrumental leader or an inclusive leader, right? So which one are you? And according to the Harvard Business School and Harvard Graduate School for Education, there are two types of leaders. There is the instrumental leader and there's the inclusive leader, right? So the instrumental leader is the person who identifies the organizational challenges and solution and takes the responsibility on their own in order to make the improvement happen, right? So these are instrumental leaders. The inclusive leader is that individual who involves others in identifying. So it's not just myself, but I'm working with other people to identify the gaps, right? So the question there is, are you an instrumental leader or are you an inclusive leader? So I'll share my own example, right? When I started off, I wanted to become an inclusive leader. And what happened there was, when you become an inclusive leader, you are now testing the waters in terms of, sino ba dito sa mga staff members ko yung magiging ally ko in order to bring about that change, right? Because in a school setting, there are different personalities. So who are the different people who can help me in terms of making sure that the school community carries on and we build the school together. Apparently, over the course of the academic year, what happened was, all right, the staff uh, were more of, they like to be told what to do rather than asking them for ideas. So now I had to shift towards the second half of the academic year into becoming an instrumental leader and take things on my own for the time being, right? And what I did in the second half of the year was, all right, I've identified that there are staff members who could do the work, so I empowered these staff members. And then I gave them the ability and the capacity to, all right, you lead specific teams. So that way we can involve as many people as we can. So again, it doesn't mean that you're an inclusive leader throughout or you're an instrumental leader throughout, but there are different times within the scope of your work that you might be called to become an instrumental leader or you might be called to be an inclusive leader, right? But the main goal there is, at the end of the day, we want to have inclusive leadership. We want to make sure everybody is involved in making change happen. Because at the end of the day, we need buy-in. Yung instrumental leadership, yes, it could be important for a short period of time, especially if the school is in a mess or it's out of control, or if certain teachers aren't used to being led or being delegated on, you know. So at times being instrumental might be critical, but our goal is, in the course of time, we need to make sure that we are getting the community ready to foster inclusive leadership, right? So other schools would call this shared leadership. Other leaders would call this capacity building. Regardless of what you call it, right? We want to get as many leaders involved in order to make change happen, right? Because at the end of the day, the teachers will stay, and then your principal could be moved to another school, right? Okay, so that's one part. The other part now is looking at gaps, right? In your challenges, you've identified gaps, and many of the gaps that you've identified are what we call performance gaps, right? They are the things that need to be met, right? So yung literacy gap, yung gap sa mathematics and sa science, all of these are performance gaps because they have something to do with what should have happened, right? The other type of gap are opportunity gaps, and these are things that you want to improve on. So you've addressed certain things, and now you want things to go further. You want to go beyond what you've done. And regardless if it's a performance gap or an opportunity gap, this is one tool that you could use to bring your team on board, right? And again, this is part of being an inclusive leader, right? It's part of being an inclusive leader. So we're going to use the Nadler-Tushman congruence model in order to look at how this works, right? So the input would be, all right, I can see as a primary school teacher or an elementary school teacher that there are gaps in the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? So that's your input. You've got data to prove that there is a problem in that particular area. So now what are you going to do? You're going to identify, number one, the work that needs to happen in order to address that challenge. Number two, you need to identify the culture that you need to build in order for that work to take place. Kasi paano kung hindi ready yung mga tao, right? You need to put in the correct perspective, the right paradigm. And number three, you need the right people on board. So if you're going to work on this on this 3 R's, sino yung kailangan mo? Will you need the master teachers there? Will you need the classroom teachers, the subject teachers, or the subject area heads for that discussion? Right? So who are the right people to bring on the table in order for you to solve the problem? right? Gone are the days when you're working like Goliath na, or not Goliath, sorry, like Samson, where you have all the problems on your shoulders, right? And then of course, number 4, the structure. What structure do you need to build for the people to work with? And then lastly, what is the output that you are aspiring in order for you to get this thing running? Okay, so these are the different descriptions of all those key elements that you need in order for this to happen. And again, there's one word that can summarize this, and that is collaboration. Right? This cannot happen if you do not have a collaborative working environment. And that's why in the very beginning of this section, we started talking about testing the political landscape, looking at the culture, right? The resistance from people. Because at the end of the day, you need allies. Who are the people who you can work with in order for you to push your agenda forward in favor of student learning, right? At the end of the day, it's all about student learning. All right. So this is another tool. So we've looked at three different tools. We've looked at the Nadler-Tushman congruence model. We've looked at the PDCA model for caring, and also we've looked at the model on inclusive and instrumental leadership, right? So these are potentially different aspects that you could look at when you are leading your team within your school context, right? The next thing there now is, and this is why I've asked the question, what are the different things that your colleagues have encountered, right? And since the pandemic, mental health has been at the forefront of everything, right? And the more we need to promote this, it's important that we look out for each other's mental health. Gone are the days when mental health is stigmatized. So the stigma behind mental health should be out of the window, because all of us need this. We need a person to talk to. We need people who would understand us. We need to recognize what is happening, and we need to process that with the right people, right? Because at the end of the day, yes, there is such a thing as teacher burnout. Yes, there is a thing as teacher overload, and we need to look after the teachers, right? If we don't, if we just keep feeding teachers with all these different things and not put their mental well-being and mental health, their R&R, their relaxation and rest in mind or in consideration, then that's a red flag. We need to make sure that we have this in place for the teachers as well. It's all part of that readiness, right? We need to be ready to address this as well. And of course, relationship building, right? You are probably within this scope already, especially if you are a school that started welcoming students back in November, right? So you probably have relationships being reestablished among your peers, established between teachers and students, and potentially teachers and parents, right? So this is something that needs to be intensified. It needs to be looked at, because at the end of the day, we need the right people to support student learning. I'm going to take this quotation from Daniel Goleman's work, his book entitled Working with Emotional Intelligence. Right. So Daniel Goleman is one of the renowned authors who advocates a lot when it comes to emotional intelligence. And in his book, he quotes this, we have things in place, and some of the things that we do could lead to potential failures, right? And when failures do happen, we need to acknowledge that they could be correctable mistakes, and we need to take the right steps in order to make sure that they don't happen. Right? So it's not just looking at them and say, oh, mali yan, or nagkamali ako dyan, or this thing did not go right. Acknowledging the problems is one thing, but the other thing now would be, how do we make sure that these mistakes don't happen again? So let's say one of the management debacle you are encountering is communication gaps. So, and you've already identified that this year. And if communication gaps is still an issue the following year, that means you've not corrected that, right? What this is trying to say is, we need to make sure that whenever mistakes do happen, we need to voice out the solution or the correctable action in the voice of hope, right? So when someone comes to you and says to you that, oh, I've made this mistake, our response as leaders should be, yes, that happens. This is what we can do next time so it doesn't happen again. We need to look for proactive ways on how to positively address mistakes that have happened. And in a world where everything is very much delicate and sensitive, we need to make sure that as leaders, we need to express that hope for people. It's very important. You know, we're dealing with teachers, and teachers can be very much overwhelmed with their workload, as you rightly put. So at the end of the day, it's making sure that the teachers feel supported. You know, I had a conversation with a teacher a month ago who was so reluctant to ask for help. And at the end of the day, you know, you as leaders, you need to allow teachers to express their vulnerability. And for some reason, some teachers think na pag pinakita nilang vulnerable sila, they are showing weakness, and weakness is incompetence. You know, if you are a wise leader, you should see that vulnerability is an element of strength, that person is opening up to you because that person needs help. And in order for us to demonstrate that wisdom in leadership, we need to make sure that we support them in the process. You know, it's changing the narrative for people. Another example I could share is, whenever I call teachers into my office, and I think it was very much cultural before I got to India, na pag pinapatawag sila sa principal's office, they're in trouble. So yun yung preconceived notion, whether it's a student, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a parent. You know, they always think that they're being called to the principal's office because there is a problem. You know, at the end of the day, I had to inform certain teachers, no, you're not in trouble. You're here because I wanted to share with you that I'm giving you a different responsibility next year to lead, or because you've done a really good job. You know, so there are ways by which you could change the narrative, so that way people see the positive things out of what is happening. You know, it is not an easy ride. It's not a very an entirely optimistic ride as well. That's why as leaders, we need to insert these different aspects of optimism along the way. And of course, as you start the academic year, we need to look at developing essential agreements with the team. You know, looking at agreeing on principles. You know, how many of you set goals with your teachers at the start of the year? So when the school year starts in August, I'm going to sit with all my 40 teachers and develop essential agreements on how we will work together collaboratively to make sure that the things that we do lead to impactful growth. There are different ways by which you could do this, different models, but the start of the year is one thing, and always start the year in a positive note. And having said that, as we wrap up this session, I'd like to ask you, if you could be as specific as possible. After you've heard the things that we've shared in this session, what would be that one thing that you will do with your teachers, with your colleagues, or with your team after this session? All right. So I'll give you 2 minutes for this. Okay. Thank you for your responses. The tools that we've shared in today's session, they're pretty much very conceptual. So when we look at that, it means you could practically use it in different scenarios within your school. So if you're thinking of using the Nadler-Tushman model, that means you're looking at evaluating what you're already doing and looking at the gaps that need to be addressed. And again, it's bringing the right people from your team to work together. Okay. I believe the word correctable mistakes is from Daniel Goleman's work on working with emotional intelligence. So it's a very easy read. It's coming as a It comes in as a very important tool when you're working with people. So yeah, I highly encourage if you could go through this own book. It works really well when you're working with teams and we're working with individuals. All right, and yeah, I've put the title of the book on the slides so you could have a look on your in your own time. All right, so thank you for this. And in conclusion, just a few things, right? So we need to keep in mind that we are now, number one, we are living in a very exhausted education sector, right? Teachers practically have not had the downtime as many other industries have. Because if you look at the industry sector, the corporate sector, with the dawn of Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever online device, Google Hangouts, right? Google Talk, you are now being expected to do exactly the same thing that you were doing before the pandemic. Not discounting the fact that you've already been through an exhaustive 2.5 years of the pandemic, right? So what do I mean? Yung mga nasa corporate, they probably have a 3-day work week where they come where they come to the office, and 2 of those 5 days they work remotely at home. So there's so many different permutations in terms of changes in work environment. In other words, for teachers, the pandemic has not changed that at all. So we're dealing with a lot of exhausted teachers, right? So we need to be very careful. And when I took over the principalship in my school, I told them that don't expect me to change things and to introduce things randomly, because at the end of the day, I will only make changes if there's a purpose for changing things. Otherwise, it's pretty much status quo on the first year. Because the main focus that I did was putting back systems after the pandemic. So it's very there's a lot of learning curves, steep learning curves for myself as a leader. So schools go through that, and your principals might be going through that as well. And even yourselves as school leaders might be going through that in different ways, right? And then number 2, continue to check in on people's well-being, especially when you start opening classes in August. Even though, yes, they might have gone through a 2-month or a 1-month break, but still, it still pays well to ask them how things are. And number 3, continue to use data in making informed decisions. So whether you're making simple changes or high impact change processes, use data. If you will notice, yung Nadler-Tushman model and the PDCA model, those are highly dependent on data. You need data in order to put things in place. Number 4, relationship building, empowering the right people, creating essential agreements with the team so that way they could grow with you. Number 5, pedagogical practices, identifying gaps together. Sitting with the team, identifying the gaps together, and looking at potential solutions together. And number 6, technology will continue to impact education. So we need to look for ways on how we can continue updating the curriculum and making sure that we use the different tools that we have to make sure that the pedagogy and pedagogical practices are not just updated, but also relevant. All right, so having said that, I believe that takes me to the end of my presentation. These are just my professional social media accounts. So I don't have, these are all professional that are connected to my teaching and learning profession. All right, and of course, the link to the different resources that were shared in this session are all here, including the books that were cited in the presentation. All right, and